It's time to translate the science, data, and research behind dairy cattle genetics into real world applications for farmers around the globe. Brought to you by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding, the CDCB CowCast begins now. Welcome back for another episode of the CDCB CowCast. I'm your host, Katie Schmidt, and today joining us is George Wiggans. George, if you want to say hello.
To be with you. Interesting to see what we're going to talk about here.
I'm looking forward to it. And for those of you who have not heard of Dr. George Wiggans, let me tell you about him. He is a legend and a pioneer in the dairy cattle genetics community. He spent nearly 4 decades as a research geneticist at the USDA before joining CDCB as a technical advisor. He grew up as a farm kid in New York. He led the implementation of the animal model in 1989, which is how we still calculate genetic evaluations today. And he contributed to foundational research and development of U.S. genomic evaluations for purebred and crossbred dairy populations. Dr. Wiggans has authored more than 300 publications and 120 abstracts and is a very popular lecturer around the globe. He has also been honored by numerous organizations, including with the J.L. Lush Award in Animal Breeding and as a fellow award from the American Dairy Science Association. He is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a co-recipient of the USDA Secretary's Honor Award, and has been inducted into the Journal of Dairy Science 100 Club, and just last fall was recognized with a Pioneer Award from the National Dairy Shrine. So, needless to say, we can talk with George about a lot of different topics, but for his debut on the CDCB CowCast, we are going to talk about genomic evaluations and breed-based representation. So, let's get us started, George, by building the foundation for this conversation. What is the premise that genomic evaluations are built on?
With genomic evaluations, we have the opportunity to actually look into the cow's genome or DNA to figure out what she got from her parents, because that's basically where it starts. The top animal typically has top parents. And with the DNA analysis, we can see which sections of the chromosome from each parent was received. And the concept is that by having a large, what we call reference population, we can assign genetic values to these segments of the chromosome. So when we put it all together and add it all up, we can say we think that this is going to be the cow's productivity for each of the traits we analyze. So it gives us a much better idea than just a parent average, which is all we had previously. So the critical importance of this is it enables us to make fairly accurate decisions about the merit of an animal as soon as we can take a DNA sample at birth or even sometimes as an embryo.
Okay, so how does the genomic information, that genotype information, how does it relate back to cow performance? Like, how do we know what the genotype is trying to tell us?
Well, that's the critical issue, is that we have to have what we call traditional evaluations, which have collected data from farms all over the country, or even all over the world actually, to understand which animals are the most productive. Then with our analysis for each of the traits that we analyze, we can put that together to come up with a profile or an index as to how profitable this animal will be, and the subindexes for individual trait areas of interest. So then the genomics builds on that, because it's only by having those traditional evaluations, which have collected the data from the traits, that we're able to then do the second analysis to assign merit to each of these chromosomal segments that the animal receives from its parents. So it's all built on what we call phenotypic data, the data on the traits that are measured, which we then try to unearth or extract the genetic component of that, so we can say what gets passed on to the progeny, and then with using genomics, what the animal actually received from its parents.
Okay, so we like to teach a little bit about genetics along the way here, George. And one of the terms that you use that I think we need to to define a little further for our listeners is the reference population. What does it mean to be an animal in the reference population, or how does one become a part of that group?
We often say that this is sort of a numbers process because we need enough data in order to make accurate predictions. So, for an animal being in the reference population, it means that we both have the information on the traits that we're interested in, and we have the animal that was genotyped. And it's a kind of a chicken and egg thing that in order to justify making the investment to genotype an animal, you have to have some confidence that it's going to give you enough information to be worth making that investment. So we were fortunate initially that bull studs had saved semen samples on all the bulls they put in to their young sire sampling program. So that then when genotyping became possible, we had these animals, these bulls, that we could go back and get their genomic values. And then based on them having fairly accurate evaluations based on many daughters, we could sort of kickstart this process so that we could kind of offer something that was sufficiently accurate. We had enough information to start with. So that was the initial reference population. Now, every time we get an animal that has a genotype, that animal, those that eventually get evaluations, then they can get added to the reference population. So we can improve the accuracy of our analysis. So then when, say, other breed groups say we would like to do the same thing, of course, the question is, can we get together enough information to get started? Because we have a tradition of having quite accurate estimates, and we want to fulfill that. So we need enough data to make a decent start.
So, George, is my understanding correct then that with genetic valuations, we have a reference population which is based off of males who have many daughters and a genotype, so we can connect those two things. But when we talk about like the genetic base change that happened in April of 2025, that's based off of female information. Is that correct?
Reference is a kind of a general term that applies in various ways. Another thing relevant to the BBR is that we have a reference population for BBR calculations, which is different, and that is the bulls only one that you're talking about, and it's based on one's bulls that are pure for the breed. What I was talking about is reference population is basically all the animals that you have genotypes and traditional evaluations on, so that you have a basis for estimating those, what we call allele substitution effects. I got, for this particular marker, I got A versus B. How much difference did that make? And then just add it all up across the genome. So you're right that for setting the base, we look at cows born basically 5 years ago. So they're old enough so that they have their own reasonably accurate data, so they make a decent reference point. But it's really just establishing a reference point that all other animals can be ranked against.
Sure, right. We need a zero
Yeah,
point, if
yeah.
you will, to measure our PTAs. Yeah. So, George, let's go back to the early days of genomics. So, we know that they first were published in 2009. What breeds had access to those evaluations at that point in time, and how did that progress over the last 15-ish years?
We relied on what we call the dairy DNA repository, which had these straws of semen from the various bulls. So that gave us a basis for initiating the Holstein and I believe the Jersey. Then, as the system became successful and useful, we were able to add Brown Swiss, and then later Ayrshire and Guernsey was the last breed to be added. And particularly in the case of Guernsey, it was based on an international collaboration with Great Britain to get Guernsey genotypes. With regard to Ayrshire, we had collaboration with Canada, which has a substantial Ayrshire population, so that enabled us to get an adequate reference population for Ayrshire.
If we think about our major dairy breeds, what then limits like milking shorthorn from making it onto that list of breeds that have genomic evaluations?
In numbers, it means we have a problem that we have relatively small number of milk and shorthorn animals that have both the genotypes and traditional evaluations. And again, it gets back to the economics that what's the incentive of spending the money for a genotype if the prospect of having an accurate evaluation is fairly small because of the small reference population?
I'm thinking part of that is also linked to this breed based representation component of genomic evaluations and the assignment of a purebred population for determining what a cow is or what a bull is in terms of breed. So in 2019, we introduced this concept of breed based representation or BBR. Can you explain for listeners what that is?
Right. So recognizing that we would like to extend the genomic evaluations to crossbreds, we needed some way of identifying what the breed background was of an animal. So we used a kind of an interesting approach here, saying that we have this way of predicting an animal's genetic merit for milk yield, fat production, protein production. Why don't we use the same concept to predict an animal's portion of Holstein, Jersey, Guernsey, and so forth? So we use really the same technology, saying that a purebred animal has a 1 for that breed and a 0 for the other breeds. And then we're going to estimate the SNP effects to predict the breed component. So when we get all done using our bull reference population, where we have a lot of data and accurate determination of breed, we'll come up with a set of estimates to estimate the breed proportion, just like we estimate the milk yield or protein yield. So that was called the breed-based representation. We adjust these so that across the 5 breeds, the estimates add up to 1. And so an animal could be, 75% Holstein and 25% Jersey. And so that's what the breed-based representation, or BBR, is reported as.
I like to think of BBR as similar to the ancestry testing that we can do on humans. And we can say, I am, 25% Irish and 30% German and whatever, right? It's that makeup of our ancestry is very comparable to BBR,
Right.
correct?
It's a similar concept. Of course, we'd say that we're more accurate because we have more data.
Right, right. Absolutely. I like that confidence. And George, we're going to throw some slides up here for people to see what the genotype counts have looked like for crossbred evaluations and why we start to see this happen in 2019 with the introduction of crossbred evaluations and BBR.
This chart shows that we've had crossbred animals for some time. However, where the vertical dotted line is where it actually became much more useful to genotype crossbred animals. Previously, they may have genotyped them hoping that they would be accepted for genomic evaluation, but realizing that an evaluation of a crossbred animal was going to be less accurate because the evaluations were done on a within breed basis. In 2019, we implemented this crossbred evaluation, which is a kind of a simple concept that we're going to say, let's calculate an evaluation for this animal on each of the 5 breeds that we do evaluations for. So now the animal has 5 evaluations, and this is based on traditional evaluations before they're adjusted to individual breed bases. So at that point, they're all comparable across breed. And then by having this BBR that we've discussed, we can say, well, let's just do a weighted average. We'll multiply each evaluation by the percent of each breed that it is, add it all up, and then that will be our evaluation of this animal. So a weighted average of the component breed evaluations. So that gave us a reasonable way of having an evaluation of these crossbred animals, which recognized the individual breed basis of each animal.
Okay, that's perfect, George, because the next slide here that we have then is how those genotypes are assigned to the different breed bases from 2019. And then we pulled a snapshot of this past year of 2025. What does this tell us?
So when we compare, we see that the amount of Jersey has decreased during that time, and the proportion of Holstein has increased. This may be because there was a considerable shift to having Holstein Jersey crosses, but over time, the Holstein proportion has increased, perhaps because of the value of the greater production and the increase in components that Holsteins have shown. The other breeds have pretty much maintained their proportion over time.
Let's think about that Holstein Jersey population. So when you have a Holstein cow and you breed her to a Jersey bull, we get this nice 50-50, in theory, F1 crossbred animal. How do we know what base that animal will be assigned to in a crossbred evaluation?
I'd mentioned that the breeds are reported on individual breed basis. So then the question is, what base would the crossbred evaluation be reported on? So generally, the idea is that we use the breed of the highest BBR, in other words, the breed that is the highest component. Of course, then you would say, well, with an F1, which is close to 50-50, does it really matter that one's 51 and the other's 49? So in that case, we allow the breed of the animal's ID to be in control. So if the breed of the ID has a BBR of at least 40%, then that will be the breed that the evaluation is reported on, figuring that the producer wants to have comparable evaluations for their herd. So we try to provide them the data on the base that's most useful to them.
Because comparing a crossbred animal to a purebred animal on a different base wouldn't be a fair comparison because we're talking different reference populations and different values.
Right.
Is that fair?
Yes. As I pointed out, when on the traditional evaluations, initially it's all on the same base, but historically, people have said that I don't want my Jersey to have her milk yield production overwhelmed by the Holstein population. So 90% of the Jerseys are negative for milk yield.
Right, right, which isn't, fair because it's just a different animal to compare. It's a
Right.
different breed of cow. So the fact we can do this on their own basis is very helpful when we think about making smart and informed breeding decisions on our herds. So then, George, I think the other thing to understand is how the crossbred share of the pie, if you will, fits into the broader picture of breeds represented in the genetic evaluation system that CDCB cares for. So, can you kind of highlight what we're seeing here from our August 2025 numbers?
So this slide shows the distribution of our genomically evaluated population across breed. So not surprisingly, Holstein was over 9 million last year, and then Jersey being the next most numerous. But the thing to point out, relevant particularly to BBR, is that crossbred is the third most numerous category. So providing evaluations for crossbred met a real need in the industry. You can see the smaller numbers for Ayrshire, Brown Swiss, and Guernsey, and that the discussion of milking shorthorn would be even a smaller number.
And like I said, these are August 2025 numbers, so we know that this has changed. This is just when we take that snapshot to look at a year over year change when we put together our annual activity report. So that's why we have numbers from August 25, even though we are just through the April 2026 evaluations. So, our reason for talking about BBR today is because the April 2026 evaluations did have a change in how we define the reference population. And that's been the notable change in the April 2026 evaluations. George, can you kind of give us a high level, just like what changed in
Right.
those rules or why that's an important change?
So the BBR, as we were explaining, is a tool for telling us what proportion an animal is of each of the various breeds. But the population is changing over time, and we want to be relevant or current on our assessments here. So that's the reason that once a year we recalculate these estimates that we use for the BBR determination. So we take a recent group of bulls and recalculate these snip effect estimates, which are the basis of the analysis. We want to make this current, so that's why we recalculate these. So it means that the BBR will change over time, even though the animal's genotypes didn't change, but their proportion and calculated using a current population of animals will change slightly over time.
One of the changes as we updated the population group there is also clarification in the definition of a purebred animal as it relates to jerseys. So in April of 25, we updated all of the rules to define what purebred meant for the sake of BBR. And those are all documented online in the What's New article that CDCB shared last week for the evaluation release. But just know that there is a slight change in pedigree completeness for Jersey animals this year. And that's really the change happening on the back end of deciding what animals are included in that purebred group and maybe who isn't included in that group. So, George, the other thing I just want to make sure we address before we wrap up here today is that there is a major undertaking happening at CDCB to modernize genetic evaluations. And a part of that is changing the model that we use from an animal model to a single step model. And we'll talk more about that with listeners as we get closer to that going into effect. But do we know anything about how that move might affect BBR and crossbred evaluations?
There's an ongoing research effort to try to make our evaluations as accurate and complete as possible. For instance, we're always considering new traits to add to better capture the economic impact of an animal. So another aspect is that particularly because genomics has been so successful, there's a concern in our traditional evaluations that if the only animals that survive to have production data, basically the fuel for our genomic evaluations, are the ones that have been shown to be superior from their genotypes, we have a possibility of what we call selection bias. So we're working on the strategies to take this into account so that the evaluation simultaneously considers both the genetics and the traditional data. We expect that we'll still be able to calculate evaluations for crossbred animals so that the BBR will continue to have a role in the evaluations.
Perfect. Stay tuned for more on that topic as we get closer. We're not close for it going into effect from an industry side. So just know that sometime in the coming months, we will discuss that topic at length to make sure everybody's on the same page as we look towards that next evolution of our genetic evaluations. But George, any closing comments or thoughts on this topic as we wrap up today?
We were happy that we could come up with a strategy to meet this sort of unmet need for evaluations on crossbred animals in 2019. And we just see this as an example of the way that we try to use the data that we have to provide the best information we can. And it's been very satisfying to have a tool such as DNA analysis, which has given us such great opportunities to provide more timely and accurate data to the industry.
That's perfect, which means that I'm going to use that as our segue to thank all of the U.S. dairy producers who do contribute their phenotypic data to the National Cooperator Database for genetic evaluations, to thank the wonderful team at USDA in the Animal Genomics and Improvement Laboratory who helped pioneer this work, to the team at CDCB who continues to do the work, and to all of our member sectors and collaborators who make all of this possible within the integrated system of genetic evaluations here in the U.S. So with that, we're going to say thank you, George, for joining us for this episode, and we look forward to seeing all of you again next month for the next episode of the CDCB CowCast.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the CDCB CowCast. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe wherever you are streaming. Questions or comments about the topic covered in this episode can be sent to outreach@uscdcb.com. That's outreach@uscdcb.com. Or you can send us a message at the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to hearing from you and see you again next month.